Sometimes the loneliest place in the world is not a small empty house, but a mansion filled with lights and nobody waiting inside. On the first day of December, the Walker estate stood above the quiet hills outside a small New England town, decorated with thousands of white Christmas lights that shimmered against the cold evening sky. A giant tree reached nearly 20 feet toward the ceiling of the grand entrance hall, covered with silver ornaments and crystal stars. Fireplaces burned softly throughout the house, and holiday music floated through hidden speakers in every room. Everything looked exactly like the perfect Christmas home people dreamed about. Yet Ethan Walker walked through the enormous mansion alone. At 39 years old, he had built one of the largest investment companies in the country. Business magazines called him brilliant. Television interviews described him as one of America's most successful billionaires. But none of those headlines followed him home at night. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood before the tall windows overlooking the snowy gardens. The reflection staring back at him looked polished and confident, but his eyes carried a quiet exhaustion that no amount of money had ever managed to erase. His phone suddenly rang. The screen showed his younger sister, Claire. Ethan answered with a tired smile. "You are calling to ask if I am coming home for Christmas dinner again, are you not?" Claire laughed softly. "Mom asked me to call because she knows you ignore her messages." Ethan looked out at the empty driveway. "Tell her I have meetings." "On Christmas Eve?" she asked. He remained silent. Claire sighed. "Ethan, everyone knows you work too much because you hate being alone." He tried to joke. "I own a company with 12,000 employees. I am never alone." "That is exactly the problem," she answered quietly. Before ending the call, she added one final sentence. "This year, please do not spend Christmas with people who only know your bank account." Ethan set the phone down and walked into the library, the one room in the mansion that still felt real to him. Shelves filled with old books reached from floor to ceiling, and a small framed photograph rested on the fireplace. It showed him as a young man beside his parents during a Christmas long before wealth entered their lives. They stood outside a tiny house, smiling beneath a crooked pine tree decorated with homemade ornaments. His father had passed away years earlier, and his mother now lived with Claire across the state. Since then, every Christmas had become a reminder that success could buy comfort but never replace family. The next morning, Ethan canceled a week of meetings and climbed into his car. Instead of flying to another business conference, he drove toward the little town where he had grown up. Snow covered the roads, and old memories followed him with every mile. He remembered the bakery that sold cinnamon bread every December, the church bells that rang on Christmas Eve, and the town square where children gathered around a giant tree. As he entered the town limits, everything looked almost unchanged. Store windows glowed with holiday decorations, neighbors greeted each other on the sidewalks, and laughter drifted through the cold air. Ethan parked near the old library and stepped outside. For the first time in years, he was surrounded by people celebrating something that had nothing to do with money. He did not know that only a few blocks away, inside that quiet little library, a woman everyone seemed to avoid was carefully placing books back onto wooden shelves, completely unaware that one unexpected meeting was about to change two lonely lives forever. The old library sat quietly at the edge of the town square, almost hidden behind snow-covered maple trees and strings of Christmas lights that hung across the streets. Ethan had not stepped inside since he was a boy. He remembered checking out adventure novels there while his father waited outside with 2 cups of hot chocolate. The wooden doors looked exactly the same, worn by time, but carefully maintained. Without really knowing why, he pushed them open and walked inside. The scent of old books and fresh pine filled the room. A small Christmas tree stood near the front desk, decorated with handmade ornaments created by local children. The library was simple, warm, and alive in a way his enormous mansion never seemed to be. A few elderly people sat reading newspapers near the windows, while several children gathered around a table covered with crayons and holiday storybooks. Ethan quietly removed his gloves and looked around. Then he saw her. Naomi Brooks stood on a small wooden ladder, carefully placing books back onto a shelf. She wore a long, dark green sweater, a cream-colored scarf, and simple winter boots dusted with snow. Her movements were gentle and unhurried, and every few moments one of the children would walk over to ask her a question. She always answered with the same patient smile. A little boy carrying a stack of books tugged lightly on her sleeve. "Miss Naomi, Can we read the Christmas story again? She climbed down from the ladder and knelt beside him. Of course, but only if you promise to help me put these books away afterward. The little boy nodded excitedly. Ethan watched the scene without realizing he had stopped walking. There was something strangely comforting about the way she spoke to the children, as though the world outside the library simply did not exist. Before he could step closer, two women near the entrance whispered quietly to one another. One glanced toward Naomi before shaking her head. Such a shame, she said softly. She could have had a normal life if she had made different choices. The other woman sighed. People never forget around here. Ethan looked back at Naomi, expecting her to react, but she continued helping the children as though she had heard nothing at all. A few minutes later, an elderly man entered carrying several heavy boxes. Naomi immediately walked over and took one from his hands. You should have called me, she said kindly. You know I would have helped. The old man smiled. You already help everyone else more than enough. She laughed softly. Then one more box will not hurt. Ethan instinctively stepped forward and picked up the remaining boxes. Naomi looked at him for the first time. Their eyes met only briefly. Thank you, she said. Her voice was calm, almost shy. Ethan nodded. It looked heavy. The old man smiled at both of them. Looks like Christmas still brings good people together. Naomi carried her box toward a back room, while Ethan followed with the others. The storage room was small and filled with donated toys, blankets, and canned food waiting to be distributed before the holidays. Ethan looked around with surprise. The library collects all of this. Naomi carefully placed her box on a shelf. Not just the library. Most of the town helps. She paused for a second before adding with a gentle smile. At least the ones who can. Before Ethan could ask another question, a volunteer entered and quietly handed Naomi a list of families needing assistance before Christmas. Naomi thanked her and immediately began organizing the supplies. Ethan noticed that every name on the list had small handwritten notes beside it. Winter coats, children's books, medicine, groceries. She had thought about every family individually. As he stood there watching, he found himself wondering why a woman who spent so much of her time helping others seemed to carry the silent distance of someone the town had chosen to leave behind. Outside the library windows, snow began falling softly across the square, and for the first time in many years, Ethan forgot to check the time, forgot about meetings, and forgot that he was supposed to be somewhere else. When Ethan finally left the library that afternoon, the quiet little town felt different than it had only an hour earlier. Snow continued to fall gently across the sidewalks, and families walked through the square carrying shopping bags and cups of hot chocolate, while Christmas music drifted from the old bakery on the corner. Yet his thoughts remained inside the library with the woman who seemed to belong everywhere and nowhere at the same time. He could not understand why someone so kind appeared to be surrounded by so much distance. As he crossed the street, he noticed two older men standing outside the grocery store. One of them glanced toward the library window and quietly shook his head. She is still there helping people, the man said. The other answered, that girl never learns. After everything that happened, I would have left this town years ago. Ethan slowed his steps. What happened? He asked politely. The men looked at him with surprise, recognizing him almost immediately. One of them lowered his voice. You are not from around here anymore, are you? Ethan smiled slightly. Not for a long time. The first man shrugged. It is an old story. Better left alone. Before Ethan could ask another question, the men simply wished him a Merry Christmas and walked away. Their words only made him more curious. The next morning, Ethan returned to the library carrying a large donation check for the holiday food drive. Naomi was arranging Christmas storybooks for a reading event when he stepped inside. She looked up with the same gentle smile she had worn the day before. You came back. Ethan handed her the envelope. I thought maybe this could help a little. Naomi opened it, and her eyes widened for just a moment before she looked back at him. This is far too generous. Ethan shook his head. I have spent most of my life making numbers grow. It feels nice to know one of them might actually help someone. Naomi smiled softly. Then thank you. The library director walked over and nearly dropped the box she was carrying when she saw the amount written on the check. Within minutes, volunteers began talking excitedly about all the families they could help before Christmas. Naomi quietly slipped away toward the back room. Ethan followed a few moments later and found her organizing blankets for the donation shelves. You do not like attention very much, do you? he asked. She folded another blanket before answering. Attention usually comes with people making assumptions. Ethan leaned against the doorway. The town seems to have a lot of assumptions about you. Naomi stopped working for a second, but did not look upset. Small towns remember stories longer than people. He looked at her carefully. Are they true? She smiled, but there was sadness behind it. Does it matter? Before Ethan could answer, a little girl ran into the room carrying a knitted red scarf. Miss Naomi, you forgot yours again. Naomi laughed quietly and wrapped the scarf around her neck. Thank you, Lily. The little girl pointed at Ethan. Is he your friend? Naomi looked surprised by the question. Ethan answered before she could. I hope so. Lily smiled happily and ran back toward the reading room. Naomi looked at Ethan with quiet amusement. You should be careful. Around here people talk. Ethan looked through the window at the snow falling outside. Maybe that is exactly why I came back. That evening, Ethan drove to his sister Claire's house for dinner. The family welcomed him warmly, but before dessert his mother looked across the table and smiled. I heard you have been spending time at the library. Ethan nearly laughed. News travels fast. Claire grinned. In this town, it travels faster than the snow. Then his mother asked the question everyone seemed to be thinking. Please tell me you are not letting old rumors keep you from getting to know that young woman. She has one of the kindest hearts I have ever met. Ethan looked around the table in surprise. For the second time in 2 days, he realized that no one seemed to agree on who Naomi Brooks truly was. And somewhere beneath all those whispers was a story he suddenly wanted very much to understand. The following afternoon, the town square was transformed into a Christmas festival. Children laughed as they skated across a small ice rink. Local musicians played holiday songs beside the giant tree, and volunteers handed out cups of hot chocolate to anyone walking by. Ethan had almost forgotten how simple happiness could look. There were no reporters, no board meetings, and no conversations about stock prices. For the first time in years, he spent an entire day without checking his phone. As he walked through the crowd, he noticed Naomi standing beside a long wooden table covered with donated winter coats, scarves, and toys. She greeted every family with the same warm smile and somehow remembered the names of almost everyone who approached her. An elderly woman stopped in front of the table and quietly held Naomi's hands. Thank you for fixing my heater last winter, she whispered. Naomi gently shook her head. You do not need to thank me. The woman smiled. Maybe not, but I never forgot. Before Ethan could think about what she meant, the woman walked away. A few minutes later, a little boy ran toward Naomi and wrapped his arms around her. Mom says we have enough food because of you. Naomi knelt and adjusted the scarf around his neck. Then promise me you will save room for Christmas cookies. The boy laughed and hurried back to his family. Ethan watched every moment with growing curiosity. People kept thanking her for things she never mentioned. Groceries, school supplies, medicine, warm blankets. She accepted every kind word with quiet embarrassment and quickly changed the subject. It was as though helping others was simply part of who she was. Later that afternoon, a sudden gust of cold wind knocked several boxes off a nearby table. Toys, books, and handmade ornaments scattered across the snowy ground. Without hesitation, Ethan and Naomi both rushed over to help. They picked everything up together while children chased rolling ornaments across the square. Ethan held up a small wooden angel with one wing slightly broken. Can this be fixed? Naomi smiled and reached into her bag, pulling out a tiny tube of glue. Almost everything can be fixed if someone cares enough to try. Ethan looked at her for a second before handing her the ornament. She carefully repaired it and placed it back on the table as though it had never been damaged at all. As the sun slowly began to set, volunteers gathered around a fire pit near the center of the square. Someone passed around cups of hot chocolate, and children started singing Christmas songs. Naomi sat quietly on a wooden bench, wrapping her hands around the warm cup. Ethan sat beside her. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, he asked, "Why do you stay here if people make life so difficult for you?" Naomi looked toward the children playing beneath the lights. "Because this town was there for my mother when she was sick." Ethan turned toward her. "But I thought people treated you badly." She smiled softly. "Some do, some do not. People are complicated." He laughed quietly. "That sounds like something my father used to say." Naomi looked at him with surprise. What was he like? Ethan stared into the fire for a moment. He believed Christmas was not about what you received. He said it was about making sure nobody felt forgotten. Naomi lowered her eyes and whispered, "He sounds like a good man." Snowflakes drifted gently through the air as the church bells rang across the town. The lights on the giant Christmas tree slowly came alive, filling the square with a soft golden glow. Ethan realized he could not remember the last time he had sat beside someone without feeling the need to impress them. Naomi did not seem interested in his money, his company, or his reputation. She simply sat there enjoying the warmth of the fire and the laughter of the children. Across the square, Ethan noticed several people watching them together and quietly whispering among themselves. Naomi saw them too, but instead of looking uncomfortable, she simply stood up and carried another box of donations toward a family waiting nearby. Ethan remained on the bench, holding the cup of hot chocolate in his hands, slowly realizing that the woman everyone called the town's most rejected person somehow possessed the kindest heart he had ever encountered. The days leading up to Christmas passed quietly, and before Ethan realized it, visiting the library had become part of his routine. Every morning, he walked through the snowy streets carrying coffee from the bakery across the square. One cup was always black, just the way he liked it. The other was sweet with a little cinnamon because he had noticed Naomi always chose that flavor during the festival. She never expected him to bring it, and every time he handed it to her, she looked slightly surprised before thanking him with the same gentle smile. The library was busier than ever as volunteers prepared holiday gifts for families around town. Ethan spent hours helping move boxes, arranging books, and carrying donations to the storage room. The work was simple, but he found himself enjoying it more than meetings in glass office towers. One afternoon, after they finished organizing winter coats, Naomi asked if he could help deliver supplies to an old farmhouse outside town. The roads were covered with fresh snow, and the drive took nearly half an hour. Ethan expected they were bringing food to a single family, but when they arrived, he saw several children waiting on the porch with excited smiles. They ran toward Naomi the moment she stepped out of the car. "Miss Naomi is here," one little girl shouted. Naomi knelt and hugged each child before handing them books and wrapped packages. Ethan stood quietly beside the car, watching. An older woman opened the front door and invited them inside. The house was small but warm, with a Christmas tree decorated by hand and paper stars hanging from the windows. The woman smiled at Ethan. "You must be the friend Naomi told us about." Ethan looked surprised. "She talks about me?" Naomi laughed softly while placing groceries on the kitchen table. "Only good things." The older woman poured coffee for everyone before sitting down. "This young lady has been helping us for years. When my daughter passed away, I did not know how I was going to raise these children alone. Naomi came every week, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with books, sometimes just to listen." Ethan looked at Naomi. She lowered her eyes and quietly changed the subject, asking the children about school. On the drive back to town, neither of them spoke for several miles. Finally, Ethan asked, "How many families do you help?" Naomi looked out the window at the snow-covered fields. "I do not know anymore." "And you pay for all of this yourself?" She smiled gently. "People help when they can." Ethan noticed she had not answered the question. Later that evening, they returned to the library to put away the remaining donations. While Naomi was helping a volunteer near the front desk, Ethan carried several boxes into the storage room. One box slipped from his hands and old files scattered across the floor. As he knelt to pick them up, he noticed folders labeled with names from around town. Inside were receipts for medicine, heating bills, school supplies, and food deliveries. Many of the payments had been made anonymously over several years. At the bottom of the stack was a small notebook. Ethan opened it carefully. Each page contained handwritten notes listing families who needed help, along with simple reminders beside their names. Buy winter boots for Tommy. Replace Mrs. Harper's furnace filter. Pay for Lily's school trip. Every page ended with the same sentence written neatly across the bottom. "Do not let anyone feel forgotten at Christmas." Ethan slowly closed the notebook. Suddenly, he understood why people kept thanking Naomi for things she never mentioned. She had quietly spent years carrying the burdens of an entire town while asking for nothing in return. As he stood there holding the little notebook in his hands, he realized that the woman everyone called the town's most rejected person might actually be the one holding its heart together. That evening, after the library had closed and the last volunteer had gone home, Naomi carefully locked the front door and stood quietly beneath the Christmas lights hanging across the town square. Snow drifted gently through the cold air, covering the sidewalks with a fresh white blanket. Ethan stepped outside behind her, still thinking about the notebook he had discovered in the storage room. He had spent his entire career studying numbers and business reports, but those simple handwritten pages had affected him more deeply than any financial document he had ever read. Naomi pulled her cream-colored scarf a little tighter around her neck and smiled at the falling snow. It looks like Christmas is finally arriving. Ethan looked at her for a moment before speaking. Why did you never tell anyone what you were doing? She glanced at him with quiet surprise. Tell them what? The families, the donations, the bills you paid, the children you helped. Naomi lowered her eyes and continued walking. Because they did not need to know who helped them. They only needed help. Ethan followed beside her through the nearly empty streets. Most people would want credit. Naomi smiled softly. My mother used to tell me that kindness becomes smaller the moment you expect applause for it. They reached the center of the town square where a giant Christmas tree stood covered in thousands of lights. A few children were still skating nearby, while parents watched from wooden benches. Ethan suddenly realized he did not want the evening to end. Would you like to have dinner with me tomorrow night? Naomi looked surprised. Dinner? He nodded. Nothing fancy. Just dinner. She laughed quietly. You are asking the woman everyone seems to avoid. Ethan looked toward the tree. I think everyone else might have missed something important. Before she could answer, his phone began ringing. The screen showed Claire's name. Ethan answered, and his sister immediately spoke without saying hello. Mom invited half the family for Christmas Eve dinner. She wants to know if you are finally bringing someone. Ethan looked at Naomi standing beside the lights. Claire continued talking. Please do not tell me you are coming alone again. Mom has already started worrying about you. Ethan smiled without realizing it. What if I did bring someone? There was silence for a second before Claire nearly shouted. You are serious? Ethan laughed softly. Maybe. Naomi looked at him curiously. After the call ended, she folded her hands together and asked, Family emergency? Ethan shook his head. Actually, I need a favor. She raised one eyebrow. That sounds dangerous. He smiled for the first time in what felt like years. My family believes I work too much because I do not have anyone to share my life with. They keep trying to fix me. Naomi laughed quietly. Families are good at that. Ethan took a slow breath. Would you come to Christmas Eve dinner with me? Her smile disappeared for a moment. You mean as your guest? He hesitated before answering honestly. As the person everyone believes I have been secretly dating. Naomi stared at him in complete surprise. Snowflakes landed softly on her scarf while the lights from the Christmas tree reflected in her eyes. You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend? Ethan nodded. Just for one evening. My family would stop worrying, and afterward everything could go back to normal. Naomi looked down at the snow beneath her boots. The town around them had spent years creating stories about her without ever asking who she really was. Pretending to be someone else felt strangely familiar. She looked back at Ethan and saw no arrogance in his face, only the quiet loneliness she had noticed from the very beginning. The church bells rang across the square as she finally smiled and gave the smallest nod. All right, she whispered. Just for Christmas Eve. Neither of them realized that the agreement they had made beneath the lights of that old Christmas tree was about to change both of their lives in ways neither money nor time could have ever planned. The next evening, fresh snow covered the roads leading to Claire's house, and every window glowed with the warm light of Christmas decorations. Ethan stood in the entrance hall of his mansion adjusting his dark suit while looking at the staircase. For the first time in many years, he felt nervous about attending a family dinner. A few moments later, Naomi slowly walked downstairs wearing a simple cream-colored dress with a long winter coat and the same knitted red scarf the little girl from the library had returned to her. She looked elegant without trying to impress anyone. Ethan smiled softly. You look wonderful. Naomi laughed quietly. I think your family expects someone much more glamorous. Ethan opened the front door for her. Trust me, they are going to love you. The drive to Claire's house was peaceful. Christmas songs played softly on the radio while snowflakes drifted across the windshield. Naomi looked out the window at the decorated houses they passed. Your hometown really loves Christmas. Ethan nodded. My father believed it was the one day every person deserved to feel like they belonged somewhere. Naomi smiled, but said nothing. When they arrived, Claire opened the front door before they could even knock. Her eyes immediately landed on Naomi. Then a huge smile spread across her face. "So you are the mystery woman." Naomi looked slightly embarrassed. "I hope that is a good thing." Claire gently took her hands. "Anyone who finally convinced my brother to leave his office is already family to me." Inside the house, the smell of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and fresh bread filled the air. Ethan's mother walked into the living room carrying a tray of cookies. The moment she saw Naomi, she stopped for a second before setting the tray down. Then she walked forward and wrapped her arms around her. "I am so happy to finally meet you." Naomi looked surprised by the warm welcome. "Thank you for having me." The evening quickly filled with laughter. Claire's children pulled Naomi toward the Christmas tree to help them hang the last few ornaments. Ethan watched from across the room as she knelt beside them, listening carefully to every story they wanted to tell. His mother quietly stepped beside him. "She has kind eyes," she whispered. Ethan smiled without taking his eyes off Naomi. "She does." During dinner, everyone shared old family memories. Claire laughed about the time Ethan had fallen into a frozen pond trying to rescue a toy boat when he was 10 years old. Naomi covered her mouth to hide her laughter. "I would never have guessed that." Ethan pretended to look offended. "I was very brave." Even his mother laughed. For the first time in years, Ethan realized he was not thinking about business. He was simply enjoying being with people he loved. After dinner, the family gathered around the fireplace while the children opened small Christmas gifts. Claire handed Naomi a wrapped package. "This one is for you." Naomi looked confused. "But I did not bring anything." Claire smiled. "You brought my brother home. That is enough." Naomi slowly opened the package and found a handmade ornament shaped like a little book. Her eyes became quiet for a moment. "It is beautiful." Ethan's mother looked at her kindly. "Every year we add one ornament for someone special." Naomi gently held the little book in her hands while the fire crackled softly beside them. Across the room, Ethan realized the enormous mansion he had left behind suddenly felt empty compared to this simple house filled with love. As the evening came to an end, everyone stepped outside to watch the first heavy snowfall of Christmas week. Naomi stood beside Ethan beneath the porch lights, holding the small ornament carefully against her heart. Across the street, several neighbors waved and smiled at them together. For the first time since returning home, Ethan noticed that the whispers surrounding Naomi had begun to change, and he had the strange feeling that the truth about the woman beside him was finally starting to find its way into the light. Christmas Eve arrived beneath a sky filled with slow falling snow, and the entire town seemed wrapped in a quiet kind of magic. Church bells echoed across the streets while families gathered in the square to exchange gifts and share warm meals. Ethan had planned to spend the morning helping at the library before attending the evening service with his family, but when he arrived, he found the front doors already open and dozens of volunteers moving quickly from one room to another. Naomi stood near the donation shelves checking names off a long list while children carried wrapped packages toward waiting cars. She looked up when Ethan entered and smiled. "I was hoping you would come. We are making the last deliveries before tonight." Without another word, he took off his coat and joined the volunteers. Together they loaded boxes of food, blankets, books, and toys into several cars. Ethan noticed that almost every volunteer seemed to know Naomi personally. Some greeted her with hugs. Others quietly thanked her for things he still did not fully understand. Around noon, the final stop brought them to the old church at the edge of town, where dozens of families had gathered for a holiday meal. As volunteers carried supplies inside, the pastor stepped onto the small stage and looked out across the room. His eyes found Naomi immediately. "Before we begin," he said gently, "there is something this town should finally hear." Naomi quietly shook her head, but the pastor smiled kindly. "You have hidden behind silence long enough." The room slowly grew quiet. Ethan stood only a few feet away, watching Naomi lower her eyes. The pastor continued. "Many years ago, when the factory closed and families began losing their homes, someone started leaving groceries on porches during the night. Heating bills were paid without names attached. School lunches appeared for children who could not afford them. Every Christmas, gifts arrived for families who thought they had been forgotten." People around the room began looking at one another. The pastor held up a small notebook. Ethan immediately recognized it as the same one he had found in the library storage room. The entire time, the person behind those acts of kindness was standing quietly among us. He turned toward Naomi. It was always her. Complete silence filled the church. An elderly woman slowly stood from her seat. Tears filled her eyes as she walked toward Naomi. You paid for my husband's medicine, did you not? Naomi gently looked away. Another man stepped forward. You bought winter coats for my daughters. A young mother began crying softly. The books that arrived after my husband passed away, that was you too. Naomi finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I only did what my mother taught me to do. She always said nobody should feel forgotten at Christmas. One by one, people began surrounding her. Some thanked her. Others apologized for believing old rumors that had followed her for years. Ethan stood quietly watching the woman he thought he was helping discover that she had been carrying an entire community on her shoulders all along. Claire stepped beside him and smiled softly. You finally know the truth. Ethan nodded without taking his eyes off Naomi. No, he answered quietly. I think I am only beginning to understand. A little girl suddenly ran through the crowd and hugged Naomi around the waist. Soon several more children joined her. The church filled with laughter and tears at the same time. Outside, snow continued falling across the town, covering old mistakes and old judgments beneath a blanket of white. Ethan looked at Naomi surrounded by people whose lives she had quietly changed, and he realized that somewhere between the library, the Christmas lights, and the little notebook filled with names, his heart had stopped pretending. The agreement they made beneath the tree was over, but the feeling growing inside him was more real than anything money had ever given him. Christmas morning arrived wrapped in fresh snow, and the little town looked as though it had stepped out of an old holiday story. The church bells rang softly across the quiet streets while families gathered together carrying gifts and cups of hot chocolate. Ethan stood outside the library before sunrise, his hands in the pockets of his winter coat, watching snowflakes drift through the glow of the streetlights. For the first time in many years, he did not feel the emptiness that usually followed him through the holiday season. A few moments later, Naomi appeared at the end of the sidewalk carrying a small box of children's books tied with a red ribbon. She smiled when she saw him. I thought I might find you here. Ethan walked over and took the box from her hands. I could not think of anywhere else I wanted to be. Together they unlocked the old wooden doors and stepped inside. The library was quiet except for the soft crackling of the fireplace. Beneath the Christmas tree stood dozens of wrapped gifts waiting for the children who would arrive later that morning. Naomi carefully arranged the books while Ethan placed toys and blankets beside them. Neither of them spoke very much. They did not need to. The silence between them had become comfortable, the kind shared by people who understood each other without explanation. A little after sunrise, families slowly began arriving. Children rushed through the doors with bright smiles, laughing as they gathered around the tree. Ethan helped hand out books while Naomi knelt beside each child, making certain no one left empty-handed. The little girl who had once returned Naomi's red scarf looked up at Ethan and asked, Are you staying here next Christmas too? Ethan looked at Naomi before answering. If she will let me. The little girl smiled happily and ran off carrying her new storybook. Later that morning, after the last gift had been given away, the library grew quiet once more. Snow continued falling outside the windows, covering the town in soft white light. Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small handmade ornament Claire had given Naomi the night before. The tiny wooden book reflected the glow from the Christmas tree. He placed it gently in Naomi's hand. My family was wrong about one thing, he said quietly. Naomi looked at him with curiosity. What do you mean? Ethan smiled. They thought I needed someone to save me from being alone at Christmas. He paused for a moment before continuing. The truth is, you reminded me what Christmas was supposed to mean. Naomi looked down at the little ornament resting in her hands. I did not do anything special. Ethan gently shook his head. You spent years making sure strangers never felt forgotten. You gave people hope without asking for anything in return. I spent my whole life building a fortune, and somehow you built something much bigger. Naomi looked through the window at the town she had never abandoned, even when people misunderstood her. My mother always believed that kindness grows when you share it. Ethan took a slow breath. Then maybe you can teach me how. Their eyes met, and for the first time neither of them needed to pretend. There was no agreement anymore, no favor, and no lonely billionaire trying to survive another holiday. There were only two people standing beside a Christmas tree, discovering that the family they had both been searching for had quietly found them when they least expected it. Outside, the church bells rang once more as children laughed in the snowy streets. Ethan looked around the little library filled with books, handmade decorations, and the warmth of ordinary people, and he realized that the grand mansion waiting for him on the hill had never truly been his home. Home was not built from marble floors or crystal chandeliers. Home was the place where someone remembered your favorite coffee, where children knew your name, where kindness was given without being seen, and where a woman with the gentlest heart in town had taught a lonely man that the greatest gift in life was never wealth at all, but having someone beside you when Christmas morning finally arrived.